The title of my sermon this morning is Spiritual Transformation, and it is drawn from that verse in the Gospel of John that reads, "I came that they may have life and have it abundantly." His father captained a ship in the Mediterranean Sea. Tragically, his mother died when he was 7, and after her death, he was sent away to school for 2 years. By 11, John went to sea with his father, making 6 voyages with him before his dad retired. Although his father wanted him to work at a sugar plantation in Jamaica, John continued sailing. When he was 18, while going to see friends, the Royal Navy forced him into service. He served as a midshipman until he attempted to desert. He was punished for it with 8 dozen lashes and a reduction in rank. John's hardship continued. He was forced off a ship and left in West Africa, where he became an indentured servant until his rescue by a ship's captain whom his father had asked to find him. During his voyage home, John's ship encountered a severe storm off the coast of Donegal, Ireland. Having been asleep, John woke to find his ship floundering and filling with water. He called out to God, and the cargo somehow shifted, covering the whole, saving the ship from sinking. The ship then drifted offshore, and drifted to shore, and John and the crew were safe. John Newton credited that experience as his spiritual resurrection. Like many, however, Newton's spiritual transformation took time. By his mid-20s, he had captained several slave ships. He left the sea at the age of 30, and by 40, he was an Anglican priest. It is then that Newton wrote the hymns, "Amazing Grace," and "Glorious things of thee are spoken." Even though he was a priest, he didn't renounce his work in the slave trade until his 60s. At that time, he helped William Wilberforce to abolish African slave trade in England, which finally ended in 1807, just before Newton died. His spiritual transformation and growth took his entire life. The spiritual life has always been a choice between old ways and new ways. Look at those interacting with Jesus while he was in Jerusalem, chapters 7 through 10 in John's Gospel. And notice that they didn't understand what Jesus was up to. The crowds were excited by his messages, but wondered if he was the Messiah. Jesus' teachings upset the religious leaders, and they were unsure what to do with him. Several times they threatened Jesus' life. They almost stoned Jesus and sent temple guards to arrest him. But each time, Jesus escaped, or the guards didn't follow the order. The crowds and the religious leaders couldn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah and would only change their minds if they saw him perform a miracle. But Jesus was not a magician and not interested in showing them a trick to make them believe. Even so, in chapter 9, Jesus gave sight to the man who had been blind since birth. When some Pharisees, a group of religious leaders, heard about it, they doubted the man. They vigorously interrogated him and even asked his parents about it. When the Pharisees questioned the man a second time, he said to them, "Here is the astonishing thing. You don't know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. Jesus' miracle was standing in front of them, but they could not or would not see it. The Pharisees weren't alone in their disbelief. Given the option to believe in Jesus, many couldn't. Today, we are caught between old ways and new ways. We're caught between how we used to live before the pandemic and how we live now and will live. The virus came to our shores, infected many, and forced us into isolation. We long for the day when we can return to the way things were. We want to live without the threat of the virus. COVID-19, however, has forced us into a place between past and future. We want the certainty of a stable future, but questions fill our minds. Will our favorite restaurant reopen? Will our barber or hair salon make it? Will the market return to its recent heights? Will the financial crisis wash away quickly, or are we in the throes of a recession or worse? What will happen to sport events, concerts, and social gatherings? Living in the gray area is difficult. It requires us to be uncomfortable while being unsettled about the future. What should we do? Those listening to Jesus found themselves in a place in between. They wanted to know if Jesus was the Messiah. They asked him repeatedly questions about it. The Pharisees wanted to know if Jesus was from God. By what he taught and by the miracles he performed, Jesus showed them he was the Messiah, the one sent by God. Jesus, however, criticized the way things had been done, the old ways, showing the faults in the teachings of the religious leaders. He implied that the teachers of yesterday were now thieves and bandits. That was tough to hear. He also told them that the past was done and a new future was breaking in. The crowds and the Pharisees struggled to accept it. Jesus gave them a choice. They had to pick between the way things were and had been, and the teachings first taught by their ancestors, or an unclear future with a new way of understanding God in the Hebrew Scriptures. Jesus showed them the weaknesses of the past and held out a future full of God's protection, safety, order, and salvation. Jesus offered them God's Easter promise of flourishing and eternal life. To receive that promise, they had to believe in Jesus, who was God's resurrected future. The tough choice the crowd and the Pharisees had is ours too. We live in an in-between time. The coronavirus is an example of our challenge. We don't know what our lives will be like in the future, but the choices we make now can create opportunities for us. We can reevaluate old assumptions. We can reassess the way we live. We can throw out things that weren't working for us. The in-between time gives us the chance to choose a new future. Jesus held out a new future for those around him. Some were willing to take the risk and follow him, but others were not. He offered them a gift from God, the gift of grace. Through his miracles and his teachings, Jesus showed them what the future could be. But the choice to follow him or not was their decision. God gives us that same choice. Follow him or not, to be Christians or not. If we choose Jesus, then we begin a spiritual transformation that often takes time, sometimes the rest of our lives. When John Newton left the slave trade to become a priest, his spiritual transformation was not complete. It took years. From our vantage point, we want Newton to renounce the slave trade right away, but he didn't. It took time because he needed spiritual growth. Like John Newton, we have multiple opportunities to transform ourselves. When we see the cross and behold the empty tomb, that is a day to transform spiritually. Each day we let go of our sinfulness and kneel before Calvary is a day of resurrection. Each day we let God into our hearts and open ourselves to God's love is a day for spiritual growth. As Christians, God gives us a choice. God will not force us or coerce us into following Jesus. God doesn't use fear to make us followers. God is not violent or threatening. Rather, our spiritual life is one of intellect and heart. We can move from the safety of the sheepfold into green pastures of the world and then return at the day's end. We come to worship, read the Bible, think about ethical choices we can make, and then go into the world to flourish. Afterward, we return home to thank God, to rejoice in our lives, and to pray for God's guidance. Each day and week, we have a choice to live as better people or not. That is the promise of the Easter resurrection. That is the grace of spiritual transformation.